The conquests in the 1750s, first of Dzungaria and then of Kashgaria, were the defining moment for the expansion of the Qing Empire as the most powerful continental empire in the world. The recognition came that the great enterprise had been pushed as far as it could be, and the country was given its final shape, really, under Qianlong. Tianxia had been fixed and unified. You might be wondering, how was this accomplished? Well, we don't have time to go into the whole story, but there's a few things we can say. First of all, the timing was good. We had the expansion at the same time, of course, of the Russian Empire eastward. The Qing Empire is pushing westward. The steppe is gradually being closed. And so powers like the Dzungars, who had been trying to reestablish a great unified Mongolian state, ultimately got caught in the middle of this and ended up crushed. So the world is getting smaller, and big empires, this was a good time for big empires to be expanding. The Qing took advantage of that moment. The Qing were also quite well organized, so we have to think of this in some measure as a logistical triumph and a military triumph. The fielding of these large bodies of men, feeding them across hostile terrain that stretched out for hundreds and hundreds of miles, was no mean feat. Certainly if this were a European story, it would be something that every school child would know a lot about in Europe and in North America. Another thing that the Qing had going for them is that the Manchus themselves were part of the inter-Asian world in which they were acting. Not so much of the areas south of Tian Shan, but these other places, Mongolia, Tibet, this was their world. They swam in this water, and they were able to deal with Mongolian princes and Tibetan lamas in a way that the Ming really had not been able to. That's not to say that there was any natural alliances formed just because of the fact of a so-called common inter-Asian background. Nothing quite so simple. But in terms of doing politics, the Qing understood the dynamics of this world much better, I think we can say, than certainly the later emperors in the Ming had, or other emperors in previous Chinese-based dynasties. That is to say, native dynasties. And then, last thing I'll mention is that they were pragmatic. The Qing did not attempt to control every aspect of local politics, local economics, local religious matters, land disputes, those sorts of things. It left, the court left the management of day-to-day affairs pretty much in the hands of local elites, whoever those might be. They might have been monks in powerful monasteries in Tibetan regions. They might have been Islamic elders in Xinjiang, princes of various sorts in Mongolia. They worked through these intermediaries, a kind of a pattern we see in empires in other parts of the world as well. The Qing took advantage of these sorts of mechanisms in place. They governed lightly, is another way of putting it. They governed lightly in these frontier areas, and I think partly for that reason, they were able to govern long and for the most part pretty successfully. Still, we have to say that the extension of the empire this far to the west was in some degree an unintended consequence of Manchu policy toward the northern frontiers. But you'd never know that from the huge PR campaign that Qianlong conducted after the consolidation of his gains, territorial gains, first in Dzungaria and then particularly in the area around the Tarim Basin. Now, unlike Kangxi, Qianlong personally did not go on campaign, but he certainly made sure that people thought that he did. He had himself portrayed in battle gear. He was frequently out at the same hunting retreat that his grandfather had built, meeting with representatives from different parts of Inter-Asia and doing his political dealings there. They did not come to Beijing. They did not meet him in the palaces there, rather in the more casual, rustic environment of Chengde and the hunting grounds in Mulan, which were even further to the north, where everybody would be sitting around in the tent, eating roast lamb and listening to Mongolian music being played while wrestlers were competing with each other nearby. That was the kind of world in which Qianlong operated, as well as the more refined areas, of course, in Jiangnan, where he traveled frequently too, when he was dealing with the Han literati. But the expansion of the empire required him to be able to play this other role as well, and to do so convincingly. He wanted the world to know about the expansion of the Qing, so he had maps made, he had stelae erected marking the places of important battle sites, he had paintings made of the 100 most brave men, generals down to common soldiers who had fought in the campaign against the Dzungars and against the Hojas. He had engravings made. He sent artists out with the army to sketch the battle. Then these artists would come back to Beijing, more complete drawings would be made, and then on the basis of these drawings, copperplate engravings were made in Paris and then brought back to China. These became collector's items. The growth of the Qing Empire was world news. This was something that Qianlong really wanted to advertise to people, and he made sure that his fellow rulers, whether it was Catherine the Great or the French king, knew about what he had done. What did the expansion of the Qing Empire mean in the long term? How did the incorporation of the Inter-Asian frontier, the final incorporation of this frontier into the Qing, shape the course of modern Chinese history? How is it seen, how is it reflected in politics and society in China today? These territories, along with Tibet, which also comes, as I mentioned earlier, under more and more direct authority of the Manchu emperor through the course of the 18th century, these territories comprise a pretty significant part of modern Chinese territory, the lands of the People's Republic of China. And they set the mold. The Qing shape sets the mold then for what will become the shape of the modern Chinese nation. These territories also represent a continuing problem of governance for the PRC. And so the relevance of Manchu Empire to modern China, I think, is hard to exaggerate. Inheritance of these territories has been very effectively naturalized by the leaders of China under the Republic of China, as well as under the People's Republic of China. And so it's easy, in a way, for us to forget that this was the result of an imperial expansion, a project of imperial expansion that took place in the late 1600s and in the 1700s. But if it hadn't been for this project of imperial expansion, we can be pretty sure that China today would be half the size that it is now. An awareness of the Qing imperial enterprise during the High Qing reminds us that while much is made of the continuity of China as the last of the antique empires to survive into the modern era, this is something of a misunderstanding. That is to say, China today is the successor state, we can say, of imperial China, but more specifically, it is the successor state of the Qing Empire, which was a vast, hybrid, polyethnic, multinational state that brought peoples of very different backgrounds with different religious traditions, different languages together in a kind of gunpowder empire of a type that is quite comparable to, say, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Romanov Empire. It represented the synthesis of centuries of interaction between China and Inter-Asian. It wasn't just another Chinese empire. In the next part of the course, when Professor Kirby will be tracing the shifts from empire to nation, it's good for us to think about, good for you to think about the challenges that Inter-Asia and its peoples have posed to the congruence of lands and peoples and languages that we commonly associate with nation, and how this has mapped onto the territories of the modern Chinese republics. They remind us of the difficulties of defining clearly what we mean when we say China or Chinese, and also of the wonderful line from Benedict Anderson, who talks about, when he's discussing the movement from empire to nation, the difficulty of stretching the short, tight skin of the nation over the gigantic body of empire.